Welcome to Crisis and Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, I want to start today by speaking directly to you, the listener. If you grew up in the United States, or, really even if you've just casually observed American politics from the outside, you have almost certainly been taught a very specific, very comforting story about how it all works.
Oh, absolutely. The classic civics class narrative.
Right. You've been taught to see politics as a relatively neutral contest of interests, that it takes place inside a fundamentally fair democratic system.
Yeah, the general idea is that everyone gets a voice, the majority rules, the minority is protected.
Exactly. And that the government acts as a sort of impartial referee, standing in the middle of the field, just blowing the whistle and someone steps out of bounds.
Right, neutral and objective.
But we are going to pose a critical, somewhat uncomfortable question to you today. What if that entire story is backward? What if the system was designed from the very beginning to filter democracy through property, class power, and elite control?
It's a heavy thought.
Right. What if the referee has never been impartial, but has actually always been playing for one specific team?
It is a profound and, frankly, an unsettling question. And to even attempt to answer it, we really have to look completely past the surface-level noise of daily politics.
Yeah, the daily news cycle.
Exactly. We have to stop looking at the partisan bickering on cable news or, obsessing over individual politicians or isolated policies. Instead, we need to look at the deep structural foundations of the state itself, the historical and institutional architecture of the whole system.
Exactly. And to guide us on this deep dive, we are exploring a highly influential, intensely provocative piece of source material. We are unpacking the 9th edition of the book Democracy for the Few by political scientist Michael Parenti.
A phenomenal text.
It really is. Our mission today is to explore this book as a comprehensive, systems-level study of the American political order. Now, before we get into the weeds of history and theory, I need to make a very crucial impartiality disclaimer.
Important to set the ground rules here.
Yes, definitely. We want to make it explicitly clear to you that the sources we are drawing from today contain politically charged, highly critical viewpoints regarding United States history and the fundamental nature of capitalism.
Right.
We, as your hosts, are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we condemning them. We are strictly acting as your guides to unpack, translate, and impartially report the systems-level analysis presented in the author's original text.
Our goal is simply to help you understand the argument being made, not to tell you what you should believe about it.
Exactly. That is an incredibly important distinction.
And Parenti's overarching thesis in this book fundamentally challenges that happy, pluralist story of U.S. government you mentioned earlier.
The idea that everyone has an equal seat at the table.
Right, that pluralist story, the idea that all groups, whether it's labor, business, environmentalists, consumers, whatever, that they all have a roughly equal say and that power is widely distributed.
Which is what we're all taught.
Exactly. But instead, he argues that American political institutions were explicitly structured from their very inception to protect concentrated property and elite power, and that they did this while deliberately and methodically limiting popular control.
Wow.
Yeah, he treats the state not as a neutral entity, but as an institution intimately linked to those who own the land, the technology, and the capital of the society.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to truly understand a claim that massive, we can't just look at what's happening in Washington today. We have to go all the way back to the drawing board.
Back to the beginning.
Right, which brings us to our first major question of this deep dive. How did the Constitution's framers understand the relationship between property and power? Because the way we're taught it, they were just these philosophical idealists obsessed with liberty and justice for all. Is that not the case?
Well, to answer that, we have to reconstruct the historical context of early America, which the source material details quite vividly. We often have this romanticized image of colonial America, right?
Oh yeah, guys in powdered wigs writing poetry about freedom.
Right. Or this purely egalitarian society of modest, hardworking farmers, all standing on relatively equal footing. But in reality, land and wealth were highly concentrated right from the start.
How concentrated are we talking?
By the 1700s, 3/4 of the acreage in New York belonged to fewer than a dozen people.
Wait, fewer than a dozen?
Yeah, and by 1760, fewer than 500 men controlled most of the commerce, shipping, and banking on the entire eastern seaboard.
That is insane. I had no idea it was that top-heavy.
It was. So by the time we get to 1787 and the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the Founding Fathers were not your average citizens. They were a remarkably elite group.
They were the 1% of their day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A French diplomat observing America at the time accurately described them as a class of gentlemen and creditors who lived in dread of the people attempting to despoil them of their possessions.
Wait, they lived in dread of the people. Why? Weren't these the same people they just fought a revolution alongside?
Yes,
I mean, what were they so afraid of? Was it just some abstract philosophical fear of the mob?
no, it wasn't abstract at all. There was a very real, very physical catalyst that drove them to Philadelphia in an absolute panic. The book points out that the convention didn't just happen because they thought the Articles of Confederation were a bit clunky.
Right.
It happened because of Shays' Rebellion.
Shays' Rebellion. Okay, I remember hearing that name in high school history, but it's usually glossed over as like a minor riot, like a footnote on a timeline. What actually happened?
It was far from a minor riot. It was
Yeah.
a massive armed uprising in the freezing winter of 1787 in western Massachusetts, led by a man named Daniel Shays.
Okay.
And Shays and his followers were mostly impoverished, debt-ridden farmers. What makes it so tragic is that many of these men were veterans who had just fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought for independence, but they were paid in nearly worthless paper money. And when they returned home to their farms, they faced ruinous taxes levied by the state elite in Boston, plus extortionate interest rates from Eastern creditors that sometimes reached up to 40%.
40%? That's not a loan, that's extortion. How could a farmer in the 1780s possibly pay that?
They couldn't. And when they couldn't pay, the courts would seize their family farms and throw the farmers into debtors' prisons.
That's brutal.
They were literally losing their land and their freedom. So, driven to desperation, they took up arms. They formed militias, marched on the courthouses, forcibly blocked the judges from issuing foreclosures, and started breaking their neighbors out of debtors' prisons.
So it was a full-blown class revolt.
It was. And this terrified the wealthy elites across the new nation. It was the absolute catalyst for the Constitutional Convention. George Washington himself was horrified.
Really? Washington?
Yes. He wrote to his contemporaries, warning that a constitution was immediately needed to contain the threat of the people. He explicitly stated that the anarchy of the property class could lead to ruin.
So the Constitutional Convention wasn't just a philosophical brainstorming session. It was a crisis management meeting for the ultra-wealthy.
Exactly.
They were terrified that the working class was going to literally redistribute the wealth by force.
Precisely. The fear of the propertyless majority was the animating force of the convention. Framers like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison openly viewed the new state they were designing as a necessary protector of propertied wealth against what they called the leveling impulses of the masses.
Leveling impulses, meaning making everyone equal.
Right. And they weren't hiding this.
Yeah.
Hamilton frankly stated that communities divide themselves into the few and the many, the rich and the well-born versus the mass of the people, whom he openly described as turbulent and changing.
That is just so incredibly cynical. And Madison, he's often called the father of the Constitution. Did he share that view?
He articulated it brilliantly and bluntly in the famous Federalist No. 10.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, he wrote that the most common and durable source of faction has been the various and unequal distribution of property. He argued that those who hold property and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society.
So he's just laying out class warfare as a fact of life.
Exactly. And his conclusion was that the primary object of government is the protection of the wealthy minority from the majority faction.
It's just wild to hear it stated so plainly. They were explicitly trying to figure out how to keep the appearance of popular government, the form of a republic, without allowing the actual substance of majoritarian rule to threaten their wealth.
Yes.
So practically speaking, how did they pull that off? Because the Constitution we have today doesn't explicitly say only rich people can make decisions. How did they build a machine to actually contain the majority?
They built a specific constitutional architecture designed to fragment power. In school, we learn about the separation of powers and checks and balances.
Right, the three branches.
Yeah. And we are taught to revere these as brilliant mechanisms to prevent a dictator from taking over, which they are. But the source material emphasizes that they were also specifically designed as what Madison called auxiliary precautions against the tyranny of the propertyless majority.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
Well, you have a bicameral legislature, an executive veto, staggered elections, and a remarkably difficult amendment process requiring supermajorities. What's fascinating here is that the majoritarian principle, the core mechanism of actual democracy, where the majority gets to decide what happens, was deliberately locked into a complex system of minority vetoes.
Minority vetoes, so a small group can just stop everything.
Exactly. Think about how difficult it is to actually pass a law. If a popular movement representing the working class somehow managed to capture the House of Representatives, they would still have to get their legislation past the Senate. If they somehow got it past the Senate, they would face the president's veto. If they somehow overcame the veto or secured the presidency, they would face the Supreme Court, which could simply declare their economic reforms unconstitutional.
It's like an obstacle course where the hurdles just keep getting higher and higher. And on top of that, they didn't even let the public vote directly for most of these offices, right?
Exactly. Notice the indirect forms of representation designed to insulate power from the voters. The House was the only body directly elected by the people.
And even then, voting was largely restricted to white male property owners.
Right. Senators were not originally elected by the public. They were chosen by state legislatures, which were dominated by the wealthy. It took 126 years and the 17th Amendment to finally allow the direct election of senators.
126 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the president was, and still is, chosen by an electoral college explicitly designed to act as a damper on popular sentiment. And the Supreme Court justices were appointed for life by the indirectly elected president and confirmed by the indirectly elected Senate. It was a fortress against the popular will.
Okay, so they built this incredible fortress to insulate themselves from the masses, but surely they didn't just sit in the fortress and do nothing. How did they use this new, powerful federal government to their advantage?
Once they built the fortress, they immediately used it to enrich themselves.
Of course they did.
A prime example highlighted in the text is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This is the section that gives Congress the power to lay taxes, regulate commerce, and crucially, to pay debts.
Pay debts, okay.
Now, to understand why this is so important, we have to go back to the Revolutionary War. Under the previous weaker government, the Articles of Confederation, the government had issued paper scrip, basically IOUs, to pay soldiers, small farmers, and suppliers during the war.
Right, the worthless paper money you mentioned earlier with Daniel Shays.
Yes. Because the old government was weak and didn't have the power to levy taxes, everybody knew it couldn't back up those IOUs. So this scrip became nearly worthless.
Like literal pennies on the dollar.
Exactly. Imagine holding a piece of paper that says the government owes you $20, but everyone knows the government is broke. If you are a starving veteran whose farm is failing, you might sell that $20 IOU to a wealthy speculator for $2 just so you can buy food for your family today.
Right, you're desperate.
So wealthy speculators bought up massive amounts of this scrip from impoverished veterans for practically nothing.
I think I see where this is going, and it makes my blood boil.
It should. Under the new Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, pushed through policies where the new, strong federal government assumed all those old debts at face value.
Let me get this straight. The wealthy speculators who bought the IOUs for pennies on the dollar suddenly had them honored at full price by the new government.
Exactly. It was an extraordinary upward redistribution of wealth right at the nation's founding.
But wait, where did the new government get the money to pay those speculators?
By using its newly granted taxing power to collect money from the working populace. The very people, the very veterans who had sold their scrip out of desperation in the first place.
So they taxed the poor veterans to pay the rich speculators who scammed the veterans.
The federal government essentially used the public treasury to create private capital for the elite. This firmly established the dynamic of the state, acting as an engine for private wealth accumulation.
That is staggering. But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here. You're painting this picture of a completely self-serving elite. But didn't they give us the Bill of Rights?
Ah, yes.
The freedom of speech, freedom of religion, protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Doesn't that prove they actually cared about the rights of the common people?
That is the common narrative. But the source material turns that completely on its head. We always think of the Bill of Rights as the crown jewel of the founders' democratic vision. But the text points out that the framers actually voted almost unanimously against including a Bill of Rights during the convention in Philadelphia.
Wait, what? They voted against it?
They didn't want it.
Then how did we get it?
It wasn't some magnanimous gift. It was a reluctant, forced democratic concession. When the framers sent the new Constitution out to the states to be ratified, they faced massive popular resistance. The common people looked at this powerful new centralized government and said, absolutely not. Not unless you guarantee our fundamental rights in writing.
So the people demanded it.
The elites realized that if they didn't promise the swift adoption of a Bill of Rights, the Constitution would never be ratified, and they might face another, even larger popular rebellion. So the Bill of Rights was a product of class struggle from the bottom up. It was extorted from the elite, not handed down by their benevolence.
Wow. So the design of the system was basically a compromise. It was a balance between the desires of the elite to protect their property and enrich themselves and the absolute necessity of granting just enough democratic concessions to keep the populace from burning the whole thing down.
That is a perfect summary.
Okay, so they build this constitutional fortress to protect wealth in 1787, but how does that machine sustain itself over 200 years? There has to be some kind of reward system keeping the politicians and the judges in line today.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to the next major piece of the puzzle, the incentive structure. Because once you design a system to protect wealth, you inherently create an environment that rewards anyone who maintains that exact arrangement, right?
Exactly. It's not just about what happened in 1787. It's about the machine they built and how it runs today. The system is set up so that political actors, the courts, and state institutions are continually rewarded for protecting investment, maintaining social order, and defending concentrated wealth. Think about the life of a modern politician. If you are a politician who supports corporate subsidies, deregulation, and free market expansion, the system rewards you immensely. You get massive campaign funding from corporate peaks, you get favorable coverage in the corporate-owned media, and when you leave office, you are virtually guaranteed a lucrative multi-million-dollar career as a lobbyist.
It's a golden escalator. As long as you play ball, the system takes care of you.
Right.
But what if you don't play ball? What if a politician or a grassroots movement tries to genuinely challenge that structure?
The incentives run violently the other way. The course material emphasizes how the state handles labor unrest or democratic insurgency. When working-class people organize to demand wealth redistribution, universal health care, or fundamental workplace rights, the system does not view them as voices to be empowered or constituents to be served.
How does it view them?
It treats them as pressures to be managed, contained, or, if necessary, suppressed. The primary function of the state in these moments is to ensure that the process of capital accumulation is not fatally disrupted.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the Supreme Court's historical role in this incentive structure.
Oh, this is a fascinating part of the text.
Right, because we are taught to revere the Supreme Court as this ultimate impartial arbiter of justice. They wear the black robes, they sit above the fray, they just call balls and strikes based on the Constitution.
That's the myth.
But Parenti's book argues that throughout most of its history, the Supreme Court has engaged in blatant conservative judicial activism. They didn't just passively interpret the law, they actively twisted it into pretzels to protect corporate property rights over human rights. Can you explain the concept of substantive due process? Because when I read that in the source material, my jaw hit the floor.
Yeah. Substantive due process as applied to corporations is a fascinating and, frankly, horrifying legal fiction. Let's look at the 14th Amendment. It was adopted right after the Civil War, and its explicit, undeniable intent was to protect the rights of newly emancipated black citizens in the South. It stated that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
Right, so a southern state couldn't just arbitrarily throw a freedman in jail or take his property. It makes perfect sense.
It does. But the conservative activists on the Supreme Court in the late 19th and early 20th centuries essentially hijacked this amendment.
Hijacked it how?
They were looking for a way to stop state governments from passing laws that protected workers. So they declared that corporations were legally persons under the 14th Amendment.
Wait, they took an amendment written for emancipated slaves and applied it to a steel monopoly.
Yes, and then they took it a step further. They argued that when a state passed a law, say, a law setting a minimum wage, or a law limiting bakers to a 10-hour workday so they wouldn't die of exhaustion, that state was depriving the corporate person of its property without due process.
You have got to be kidding me.
No. They argued that regulations infringed on the corporation's liberty of contract. It was a staggering inversion of the amendment's original intent. They used a civil rights law to strike down hundreds of labor regulations.
It really was an unbelievable logical leap, and the hypocrisy is just glaring when you look at how they applied the rules. They were wildly inconsistent about their constitutional logic depending on what served elite interests at that specific moment.
Exactly right.
Like, if the federal government tried to pass labor reforms, the Supreme Court would strike them down using the 10th Amendment, saying, oh no, those powers are strictly reserved for the states. But if the states actually tried to pass labor reforms, the court would strike those down using the 14th Amendment, saying, oh no, you are violating the corporation's rights.
It was a neat little trap.
They literally used the 10th Amendment to stop federal reform and the 14th Amendment to stop state reform. It was heads the corporations win, tails the workers lose, every single time.
It perfectly illustrates the incentive structure of the state.
Yeah.
The judiciary was incentivized to find any constitutional rationale necessary, no matter how contradictory, to protect laissez-faire capitalism. And we see similar incentive structures within the bureaucracy and the executive branch today.
Right.
In the section on the political economy of bureaucracy, the author details how regulatory agencies are structurally compromised. We rely on agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, or the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to protect our air, our water, and our wallets from corporate abuse.
But the reality is they are routinely defanged. I've noticed this in the news. Whenever an agency actually tries to fulfill its public mandate and crack down on a major industry, they face intense backlash.
Every time.
What happens? Their budgets get slashed by Congress so they don't have enough inspectors? Their jurisdictional powers are abridged by new legislation? Or, most insidiously, they are simply subject to regulatory capture. They are stacked with industry insiders.
You'll have a former coal lobbyist appointed to head the Mining Safety Administration.
Or an agribusiness executive put in charge of food safety. The regulators literally become the servants of the regulated.
This connects directly to the concept of the unitary executive, which the book analyzes at length. Over the last century, the modern presidency has amassed immense power, far beyond what the framers explicitly wrote. But the text argues this power is primarily utilized to act as the ultimate guardian of the corporate system.
The ultimate guardian.
Yes, the president, regardless of which political party is occupying the White House, is fundamentally tasked with advancing the process of free market capital accumulation globally.
So it doesn't matter if there's a D or an R next to their name. The job description is exactly the same.
On a macroeconomic level, yes. They use executive orders, military interventions, and massive international trade negotiations to ensure that American corporate interests have unimpeded access to global resources and consumer markets.
Even if the public doesn't want it.
Exactly. They often do this while completely overriding congressional oversight or ignoring public opinion, justifying it all in the name of national security or economic necessity. The executive branch basically acts as the CEO of American capitalism.
Which perfectly sets up the next phase of our deep dive, tracing the outcomes.
Let's do it.
If the system is specifically designed to protect wealth, and the incentives reward those who maintain that design by giving them money and power, what are the actual historical outcomes of this machine running for over 2 centuries?
It's a dark history.
It is. This brings us to our second required question. How has the U.S. government historically intervened in labor struggles? Because if the pluralist story is true, the government should just sit back and let the workers and the bosses negotiate fairly, right?
If the pluralist story were true, yes. But the history detailed in the source is stark, bloody, and deeply violent. The overarching takeaway is that the government did not act as a neutral referee between labor and management. It acted as an armed enforcer for the owning class.
An armed enforcer.
During the massive industrial strikes of the 19th and early 20th centuries, workers were fighting for basic survival. They weren't asking for stock options. They were fighting for an 8-hour workday, an end to child labor, and a living wage so their families wouldn't starve.
Basic human dignity.
And almost invariably, the civil authorities intervened on the side of the employers to crush those strikes.
The examples the book provides are just harrowing. I want to walk through a few of them because they really shatter that illusion of the neutral state.
We should.
Take the Haymarket Square incident in Chicago in 1886. Workers were demonstrating for an 8-hour day. A peaceful rally is happening. Suddenly, a bomb is thrown by an unknown person. To this day, historians don't know who threw it.
Right.
It kills several police officers. The police respond by wildly firing into the crowd, killing and wounding dozens of unarmed demonstrators. And what does the state do? Do they investigate the bomber? No. The state rounds up 8 anarchist labor leaders, none of whom even threw the bomb. Some weren't even present at the rally. And they hanged 4 of them simply for their political speech and their role in organizing workers. It was a judicial murder to silence the labor movement.
And that was just the beginning. Look at the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania in 1892. Striking steel workers at the Carnegie Steel Company were locked out. The company brought in a private army of Pinkerton mercenaries to break the strike.
A private army.
Yes, a massive gun battle ensued. And when the workers managed to fend off the Pinkertons, what happened? The state's National Guard was brought in, not to disarm the company, but to protect the strikebreakers and crush the union entirely.
It wasn't just state militias either. The federal government got directly involved. In the 1894 Pullman strike, the workers who built railroad cars went on strike because the company slashed their wages but refused to lower the rent in the company-owned town.
It was a trap for the workers.
It became a nationwide solidarity strike that paralyzed the railroads. So the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, deployed the U.S. Army to break the strike. The military intervention resulted in the deaths of 34 workers. The federal government used the military to force men back to work at starvation wages.
Perhaps most notoriously, the book details the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado in 1914. Miners striking against a coal company owned by the Rockefeller family had been evicted from their company-owned homes.
By the Rockefellers.
Right. They were forced to live in a sprawling tent colony in the freezing hills with their wives and children. The Colorado National Guard, essentially acting as a private security force paid by the Rockefellers, positioned a machine gun on a hill overlooking the camp.
A machine gun aimed at families.
Yes. They fired into the tent colony and then set it ablaze. When the smoke cleared, 24 people were dead, including 2 women and 11 children who had suffocated in a pit they dug under their tent to hide from the bullets.
That is just horrifying.
The historical outcome of these labor struggles was that the state repeatedly utilized lethal military and police force to suppress democratic insurgency from the working class.
It is so incredibly dark, and it completely, thoroughly shatters the illusion of the government as a neutral peacemaker. It was an armed guard for capital. But of course, that was a century ago. They aren't usually sending the National Guard to shoot striking workers with machine guns today.
True. The methods have evolved.
Which brings us to our third required question. How do corporate interests and wealth concentration shape modern public policy? If they aren't using bullets, how are they maintaining control?
The author argues that while the methods are less overtly violent, the outcomes remain exactly the same. Public policy that looks democratic on the surface but repeatedly, systematically channels benefits upward to the wealthiest individuals and corporations. The modern mechanism for this is what Parenti terms corporate welfare.
Corporate welfare. That's a phrase you hear thrown around, but the numbers the book brings up are staggering. We are constantly subjected to political debates warning us about the ballooning costs of social welfare programs for the poor, food stamps, Medicaid, housing assistance.
Oh, constantly.
We are told the country is going broke because of these programs, but the government quietly doles out astronomical sums to the wealthiest corporations on Earth.
The math is undeniable. The text cites that in 2006, direct government payouts to big business totaled $92 billion. To put that abstract number in perspective, that was roughly 3 times what the government spent that entire year on food stamps for hungry families.
3 times as much.
Yes. And this corporate welfare takes many forms that are intentionally opaque to the average voter. It comes as tax breaks, price supports, export subsidies, loan guarantees, and massive government-funded research grants where the state pays for the research and the corporation patents the result and keeps the profits.
Right. If the pharmaceutical industry develops a drug using billions of dollars in public research grants from the NIH, they turn around and sell it back to the public at an astronomical markup.
Exactly.
But the most glaring, infuriating example of this upward redistribution is the phenomenon of the multi-billion-dollar bank bailouts. When casino capitalism leads to massive financial crashes, as it did during the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, the system perfectly reveals its true nature.
It really does.
During the boom years, the banks privatize the profits. They make billions and keep it all. But during the bust, when their reckless gambling blows up the economy, the system socializes the costs. The public taxpayers are forced to cover the private corporate losses to quote-unquote save the economy.
The text details the sheer scale of this transfer. AIG, the insurance giant, received a phenomenal $180 billion bailout.
That number is just hard to comprehend.
Bank of America received $45 billion in direct cash, plus massive asset guarantees shielding them from further losses. And the kicker, the detail that truly highlights the incentive structure we discussed earlier. While the government was handing them taxpayer money, Bank of America reported billions in profits and handed out $3.3 billion in bonuses to its senior managers.
It makes me want to pull my hair out. It is exactly like if a friend borrowed your car, drove it drunk, crashed it into a ditch, demanded you pay for a brand new luxury car, and then asked you for a tip for his trouble.
And the government just smiled and handed over the tip.
Exactly. The executives pocketed billions in bonuses for crashing the global economy, while millions of average Americans lost their homes to foreclosure and the public footed the bill.
It is a profound contradiction of the American mythology. The free market is constantly preached as a gospel of self-reliance, rugged individualism, and austerity for the working class. If you are poor, you are told to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
But for the rich.
But for the plutocracy, for the megabanks and the multinational corporations, the state functions as a massive, unconditional state-sponsored safety net.
And we see this dynamic play out even in policies that seemingly benefit the middle class, like housing subsidies. When we think of government housing assistance, we picture low-income housing projects. But the text points out the supreme irony that the vast bulk of federal housing assistance does not go to the poor.
No, it doesn't.
It goes to affluent homeowners via massive tax deductions for mortgage interest and capital gains deferrals on real estate.
And subsidized beachfront insurance. That is a brilliant example from the book. The government provides highly subsidized flood insurance for coastal properties. The book explicitly mentions the example of ex-President George H.W. Bush receiving federal insurance payouts to cover hundreds of thousands of dollars in storm damage to his massive sprawling family estate in Kennebunkport, Maine.
So the federal government is literally subsidizing the coastal mansions of billionaires and ex-presidents when a storm hits, while affordable housing for the working poor in cities remains chronically underfunded and falling apart.
That's the system.
The outcome of the system, time and time again in every era, is socialism for the rich and brutal, unforgiving free market capitalism for everyone else. Okay, if we take a breath and look at everything we've covered, the rigged constitutional design, the twisted courts, the violent labor history, the multi-billion-dollar bailouts, it logically leads us to ask, how does this continue?
A very valid question.
This brings us to part 4 of our discussion, the persistence of the system. Because if the inequality is so stark, if the environmental devastation caused by corporations is so visible, and if the bailouts are so blatantly, cartoonishly unfair, why does this system endure? We live in a country where people can theoretically go to the ballot box and vote this entire structure out of existence. Why don't they?
It is the multi-trillion-dollar question. If the system is so heavily skewed against the majority, why does the majority tolerate it? If we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer lies in the deeply entrenched feedback loops of power.
Feedback loops.
The system is entirely self-reinforcing. Wealth concentration leads directly to lobbying power and campaign finance dominance. Because of the way our elections are structured, politicians need vast, ever-increasing sums of money just to run for office.
And they can only get that from the wealthy.
This means they are completely dependent on the very corporate elites they are theoretically supposed to be regulating. As the text quotes one politician, corporations aren't just buying influence, they're buying into the political process itself. They're the gatekeepers. But beyond just money, the persistence of the system relies heavily on the structural nature of the two-party monopoly.
The two-party monopoly, I think a lot of listeners feel immense frustration with this. It constantly feels like we are choosing between the lesser of two evils. But Parenti argues this isn't an accident. It's a structural feature to prevent real change, right?
Yes. The electoral system itself is a vital feedback loop for elite control. The U.S. utilizes a winner-take-all system of elections. In any given district, whoever gets the most votes wins the single seat. This structurally freezes out third parties.
Because of the Beth.
Right. Because a candidate needs a plurality to win, voters are terrified of wasting their vote. If you are a pro-labor voter and you genuinely want to vote for a radical Green or Labor Party candidate, you are constantly told that doing so will just split the vote and allow your worst enemy to win.
The spoiler effect, you are held hostage by the fear of the worst-case scenario.
Exactly. You are forced to choose between the two major parties. And Parenti argues that despite their differences on cultural issues, both major parties are fundamentally committed to maintaining the capitalist corporate state. The author contrasts our winner-take-all system with proportional representation, or PR voting, which is used in many other modern democracies.
How does PR voting change things?
Under PR, the legislature reflects the actual vote of the populace. If a Labor Party gets 15% of the national vote, they get 15% of the seats in the legislature.
That makes so much sense. It actually gives minorities and diverse political groups a tangible voice and shatters the two-party monopoly. You don't have to win 51% of a district to get representation. If 15% of the country agrees with you, you get 15% of the power. But I'm guessing the major parties in the U.S. fiercely resist PR.
Of course. They benefit immensely from the current duopoly. It guarantees that one of the two corporate-friendly factions will always be in power. But enforcing that duopoly and maintaining the persistence of the system in the minds of the voters requires more than just election rules. It requires managing what people think, what they know, and what they believe is possible.
Which brings up the mass media. We like to think of the media as the heroic fourth estate, speaking truth to power. But the author argues that the media is essentially an ideological monopoly owned by a few massive corporate supergiants.
It's not about conspiracy, it's about structure.
Right. It isn't just about some editor sitting in a smoky room censoring bad news. It's about framing reality. The media serves officialdom.
The gatekeeping function of the media is profound. The news is essentially a product of the corporate state. Major news outlets rely almost entirely on business leaders, government officials, and military generals as their primary sources for news.
Defining what is considered serious news.
This ensures that the corporate economy is celebrated in the abstract. We obsess over the stock market ticker as if it reflects human well-being, while systemic failures like poverty or workplace injuries are treated as isolated, tragic incidents rather than structural flaws.
And the book brings up a fascinating example regarding PBS, the public broadcasting system. I always thought of PBS as the safe, non-commercial alternative to corporate media. But the text provides an example of PBS actively avoiding broadcasting documentaries that take a strong working class or labor union perspective.
And the reason is quite simple.
Why would the public broadcaster do that? Because they live in fear of alienating their corporate underwriters. Every PBS show starts with, brought to you by the David H. Koch Foundation or some major bank. So even the public alternative is fundamentally constrained by corporate financial leverage.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on Parenti here again, because reading this, it feels so bleak, like the elite win every single time. What happens when popular pressure becomes so immense that the system absolutely has to concede something? What happens when a reform movement actually breaks through the media blockade and the electoral trap?
It does happen.
Look at the New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. We got Social Security, unemployment insurance, the right to unionize. That was a massive, historic victory for the working class. Doesn't that prove the system can be transformed?
It proves the system can adapt, but Parenti argues it does not prove the system can be fundamentally transformed. The author argues that the capitalist state is incredibly adept at absorbing, narrowing, or redirecting reform to ensure its own ultimate survival.
Let's look closely at the New Deal, then.
We are taught that FDR was a radical progressive who saved the poor. But Parenti argues the New Deal was fundamentally designed to rescue the capitalist system from mass unrest and potential revolution during the Great Depression. With a quarter of the country unemployed, the threat of a socialist or communist uprising was very real to the American elite.
So you're saying FDR didn't give us Social Security out of the goodness of his heart. He gave it to us so we wouldn't bring out the guillotines.
Essentially, yes. It was a tactical, necessary concession. FDR provided real material gains, but these were the absolute minimum necessary to stabilize the system, restore purchasing power, and demobilize radical labor movements. He saved capitalism from its own collapse.
Wow.
And the ultimate proof of this thesis is what happened next. Once the crisis passed, once World War II ended and the economy boomed, the system immediately began clawing those gains back.
How did they claw it back? I mean, we still have Social Security.
We do, but look at labor rights. The Wagner Act of 1935 empowered unions and led to massive wage gains and the creation of the middle class. But just 12 years later, in 1947, a corporate-friendly Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act.
Which did what?
This legislation severely restricted unions' abilities to strike, boycott, and organize. It banned wildcat strikes and solidarity strikes. The result: union membership in the private sector peaked in the 1950s and has been shrinking for decades ever since. The system absorbed the shock of the New Deal, narrowed its scope, and eventually, methodically, redirected the balance of power back toward capital.
It's a relentless, unyielding machine. It takes a punch, steps back, and then slowly grinds you down. And it doesn't just operate within the borders of the United States. This brings us to the final analytical piece of our discussion: connecting the system outward.
The global scale.
How do government, corporate power, and ideology reinforce each other on a macro global level? How does this deep dive connect to broader structures like imperialism and the surveillance state?
To fully grasp the sheer scale of the system, we have to look at the intersection of capitalism, imperialism, and the security state. The corporate state we've been describing cannot exist through economic persuasion alone. It relies heavily on a massive domestic and international security apparatus to enforce its interests and crush dissent.
Domestically, the text details the deeply troubling history of the FBI.
Yes, we are often taught the FBI are the good guys catching bank robbers and spies. But Parenti highlights programs like COINTELPRO, which ran from the 1950s through the 1970s. For decades, the FBI engaged in illegal surveillance, infiltration, and disruption of left-wing, labor, and civil rights groups.
They didn't just spy on them, right? They actively tried to destroy them.
Yes, they used forged documents, blackmail, and undercover provocateurs to subvert organizations fighting for social justice. They targeted Martin Luther King Jr., the Black Panthers, anti-war protesters, and labor organizers. They treated citizens demanding democratic rights as enemies of the state.
Yet, at the exact same time, the text notes that the FBI largely ignored or treated very lightly right-wing extremist and terrorist groups, like the Ku Klux Klan. Why the glaring discrepancy? Why go after peaceful civil rights leaders with everything you have, but largely ignore violent white supremacists?
Because, as the author argues, you have to look at what threatens the system. Left-wing groups, even entirely peaceful ones demanding a living wage or racial equality, fundamentally challenge the corporate capitalist structure and its entrenched privileges. They want to redistribute wealth and power.
And the right-wing groups?
Right-wing extremist groups, regardless of how violent or hateful they are, do not threaten the underlying economic system. They aren't trying to democratize the workplace or seize the banks. In fact, in some historical instances, right-wing vigilantes actually do the dirty work of the owning class by terrorizing and suppressing minority labor. The security state protects the economic state.
It is entirely about protecting capital. And this protection extends globally through the mechanism of globalization. We hear globalization discussed as if it's just the weather, a natural, inevitable technological shift, bringing the world closer together. But Parenti argues we must stop viewing it that way.
He argues that globalization is a deliberate, orchestrated circumvention of democratic sovereignty. It is about escaping the very democratic concessions we talked about earlier. Multinational corporations use international trade agreements. Organizations like the WTO, often negotiated in secret tribunals, to override national labor laws, environmental protections, and consumer safety standards.
So if the American people actually manage to pass a strong environmental law, a corporation can use an international trade court to sue the government and say, this law hurts our profits, you have to repeal it.
Yes, or the government has to pay them billions in lost potential profits. It is about escaping democracy. They export capital and jobs to cheap labor markets abroad, pitting workers in the U.S. against desperate workers in developing nations in a global race to the bottom.
Placing capital above people.
It elevates corporate investment interests to a supreme global law, completely above human rights, labor rights, and planetary environmental survival.
So what does this all mean? We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with the framers terrified of indebted farmers. We looked at the courts twisting civil rights laws to protect monopolies. We examined the violent suppression of labor strikes, the absurdity of corporate welfare and bank bailouts, the media's gatekeeping, the FBI's targeting of civil rights leaders, and the global escape from democracy. We've thrown a lot of history and intense political theory at you.
We really have.
Which brings us to a critical juncture. We have to ask the defining question of this entire project. What is the crisis in perception here?
The definitive crisis in perception is that the American public is constantly, systematically encouraged by their education system, their political leaders, and the mass media to see political outcomes as simply the sum of individual choices.
We are trained to view the system through a microlens.
Exactly. If things are going wrong, if inequality is soaring, if the planet is warming, if wages are stagnant, we are told it's because we simply elected the wrong person, or a specific lobbyist broke the rules, or one party is being too partisan. We are taught to view the failures of the system as mere glitches in an otherwise perfect machine.
Exactly. We are told the system is broken and we just need to fix it by voting harder. And that standard, individualized view completely obscures the deeper structural limits of class power. It keeps us endlessly arguing over the referees and the players, getting furious at this senator or that president, without ever stepping back and realizing that the game itself, the very rules of the field, is rigged.
This is why Parenti's analysis is so crucial. When you look through a systems lens, everything changes. The entire landscape of what becomes visible shifts. When you look through a systems lens, you stop seeing a broken, clumsy democratic government failing to serve the people. Instead, you start seeing a highly functional, incredibly efficient corporate state succeeding exactly as it was designed to.
It's doing exactly what it was built for.
It is doing its job flawlessly, protecting concentrated wealth, managing dissent, and ensuring the endless accumulation of capital. The system isn't broken. It's working perfectly for the people who built it and the people who own it. This raises an important question. Where do we go from here? As we begin to wrap up our deep dive today, we want to emphasize that our goal is reflection. We aren't here to hand you a neatly packaged list of solutions or tell you who to vote for.
Right. If the problem is a 200-year-old structural machine, a 5-point policy plan isn't going to fix it overnight.
The primary takeaway for you as a listener should be the importance of understanding systems over assigning individual blame. It is too easy to just get angry at a specific CEO for being greedy or a specific politician for being corrupt. But it is about understanding incentives over personal intentions.
Because the incentives drive the behavior.
Even well-meaning politicians who enter the system with the best of intentions are quickly trapped within an incentive structure that demands they serve capital or face destruction. We must recognize the persistence of these deep historical structures over just feeling momentary, exhausting outrage at the daily news cycle. True understanding requires looking at the architecture of the building, not just yelling at the wallpaper.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on all this source material and hopefully changes how you view the world tomorrow. If the system is indeed performing exactly as designed, if it is highly successful at managing dissent, defanging reform, and channeling wealth upward regardless of who is technically in office, how much of our daily, breathless political news cycle is just theater?
That is the thought to sit with.
How much of the partisan dickering you see on cable news, the dramatic congressional hearings, the Twitter outrage, is simply a distraction? Is it all just a loud, colorful, highly produced circus meant to keep us emotionally exhausted, meant to keep us from noticing the silent, grinding mechanics of wealth accumulation happening behind the curtain?
It really shifts your perspective.
It's something to deeply think about the next time you watch a political debate or read a headline. We want to clearly credit Michael Parenti and his profound, challenging book, Democracy for the Few. We highly encourage you to read the book yourself, or better yet, borrow it from your local public library. It is packed with a vast amount of history, data, and nuanced analysis that we only just began to scratch the surface of today.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd love to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.